Hello from Intellipaat. The topic for today's session is ReactJS Basics tutorial. But before we begin, be sure to hit that bell notification icon and subscribe button so you don't miss out on any updates from us. Now, without any further ado, that being said, let's get into the agenda that we have for today. So firstly, we have a brief introduction to JavaScript. So React.js is basically an extension to JavaScript. So before understanding what React.js is and how React.js works, we need to understand what JavaScript is. And it's kind of a prerequisite for getting into React.js because you need to know the basic syntax and the basic implementation of vanilla JavaScript. So we're not going to be getting into the details of JavaScript, but we're going to go over it briefly to give you a recap and to make for a better context for React.js basically. So the first topic is the brief introduction to JavaScript. Then we will understand what React.js is, what the origin of React.js is, and what React.js is actually meant to do. Then we look at the advantages of React.js compared to other front-end technologies and whatnot. And then, of course, we have the tutorial for you guys here today. We have the basic tutorial for React.js, a little bit of hands-on to get started with React.js. We'll look into that later on, and then we'll discuss something else in the further learning category of the agenda. So, moving on to the first topic, the first agenda that we have for today, brief introduction to JavaScript. So, what is JavaScript essentially? In simple terminology, JavaScript is the programming language of HTML and the web. Now, what does that mean? So basically, you have web browsers, right? So whenever you're using web browsers, they are interpreting some sort of language to give you a render of what you're seeing on the screen at that moment in time. So basically, to implement any sort of logic, any sort of programming logic in those web pages, aside from static pages, static web pages that we normally see, to implement any sort of logic in that, any sort of mathematical operation, any sort of complex computations that are required, we use JavaScript. And the benefit of JavaScript is that it is interpretable by the majority of major web browsers that are around the world today that are being used. So, getting into the theoreticals. So, here we can basically see that it is being defined as a high level, often just in time compiled programming language. So, what does just in time compiled programming language mean? So, basically, what it implies is that unlike traditional languages like C, C, and Java, which are compiled separately and executed separately, JavaScript is executed and compiled at the same time. So basically, whenever there's no option for compiling JavaScript, it's basically a run option, and whenever you run JavaScript code, it is compiled and executed simultaneously. It is also an interpreted language, which means it is executed line by line instead of being compiled as a script entirely at the same time. So the bytecode generation happens line by line. So here we can also see that JavaScript enables interactive web pages and is an essential part of web applications. What does that mean? So basically, say imagine you have static web pages that are made completely out of HTML and CSS. So all HTML and CSS can do for you is give you static viewpoints. They for every new thing that you want to do, you have to reload a web page. So what is the solution that you have if you want to have some sort of an interactivity with the web page without reloading the web page, a functionality within the web page, sort of a logic as I discussed before. So for that, what web browsers have is interpretability for JavaScript. So basically, when you use JavaScript code within an HTML construct, you basically give way to interactivity with the website. And also, as we can see here, we have mentioned four of the most widely used web browsers out there. Although I would argue that Edge isn't used as much, but that is a debate for another day. Chrome, Firefox, Opera, all of these web browsers have an inbuilt JavaScript engine inside of them. So basically, that gives rise to JavaScript almost being used in. Basically, what this means is that every major web browser uses JavaScript in some way or the other. So, moving on further on, we have JavaScript frontend and backend. So as we discussed before, firstly, when JavaScript was introduced in the beginning, it was only being used as a front-end language. Now, what is a front-end language? A front-end language is something that is only interacting with the user, only interacting with the client, something that is present only on the client side. So initially, web browsers were using JavaScript when it was first introduced, only to have that functionality of dynamic interactivity with the user. But once it was discovered how good JavaScript as a language is, it was also implemented on the server side as well. So initially, more traditional languages were being used on the server side, like Java and PHP and all of these languages for the backend sort of implementation. And when JavaScript was discovered to be a great language, when Node.js was discovered, basically what Node.js is converting that inbuilt JavaScript engine and embedding it inside a C++ environment. So if you're wondering, does that mean do I have to learn C++ now to understand Node.js? No, that is not what it means. It just means that somebody named Ryan Dahl basically took Google Chrome's JavaScript V8 engine and embedded it inside a C++ environment, and now we call that entity Node.js. So basically, what does Node give us? So in a similar fashion where Google Chrome was initially, or any other major web browser which was using JavaScript, was initially rendering things, creating dynamic client-side applications for the user. We basically took that sort of logic and implemented it on the server side as well. So we can divide the load halfway. We can perform some activities on the server side and perform some activities on the client side, and create a perfect balance as to not overload any of the ends, whether it is the client end or the server end, with any unnecessary tasks. And it basically comes down to load balancing and reducing latency and enhancing client experience. So the introduction of Node.js also gave rise to a new trend where front-end developers would transition into back-end more, just because the back-end scripting side technology was also JavaScript, and they were familiar with JavaScript because they were front-end engineers. So this also gave a sort of platform uniformity where you didn't have to learn multiple languages to be a full-stack engineer. If you knew JavaScript using one of the front-end languages for JavaScript, you could easily transition into backend, where the backend server side scripting language was also being implemented in JavaScript, i.e., it would be Node.js and certain frameworks made using Node.js, which would have been Meteor or other sort of frameworks. So, moving on, we have a demonstration of what the old web app architecture looked like, where JavaScript wasn't a factor. So initially there were only static web pages using HTML and CSS, and every calculation, basically every computational activity other than rendering of the web page, was being done on the server side. Even minor operations such as adding two numbers or something, which it was also being done on the server side. Now, that is not to say that it would be difficult for a server to add two numbers, but imagine if 1 million people are visiting your website every hour. So performing such minimalistic calculations in that sort of quantity would also create an unnecessary load on the server. And this load can be mitigated. This load can be easily outsourced to the client side, because it wouldn't cost the client much to do that simple two number addition calculation on his side. So basically what the introduction of JavaScript did was all the non-heavy calculations, all the non-complex calculations that can be done on the client's end, can be done on the client's web browser, where it wouldn't cost too much resources on the client's end, and help the client get a better server performance, just because there is lesser load on the server. The server is only performing the quintessential, the essential activities that it is supposed to perform. All the unnecessary load has been mitigated to the client side. So basically, the introduction of JavaScript gave rise to the new web app architecture, where the server side only performs the heavier calculations and sends the data to the browser in response upon request. So as you can see here, we have also mentioned that there's a reduced overhead on the server side. So moving on, now we'll look at the syntax and advantage. So obviously we cannot explain the syntax, the entirety of how JavaScript functions in just one slide, but we'll just give you the basic overview as to what is the advantage of using JavaScript. So as you can see, we'll just firstly look at the syntax. We can see that the code is HTML, right? There's an HTML body opening, there's an HTML elements involved in it. We're just simply adding an element where we are writing script type text / JavaScript. This basically implies that what we're doing here is writing a script in JavaScript. So within that body, we can basically write any sort of programming language that we want. Here we are basically implementing a stack and writing a function for push an element into the stack. So rather than doing this on the server side, we can just, whenever we load up a website, we can just do it on the client side, because this is a very basic operation, and the client side wouldn't have to deal with much resource wastage or resource non-efficiency when performing such a normal calculation. But say this was being done on the server side, so that for every client that is accessing that server, basically it would overload the server with unnecessary things. So that is why it is better to do it on the client's end, and that is what JavaScript is for. As we can see, the latency is 0, so there is no request response system involved in this. If you're performing a calculation on the client side itself, you don't need to wait for a response from the server to get the data, and this way the web pages also function in a much more snappy and faster fashion. So moving on, what is ReactJS? Now we finally come to a point, now that we've discussed the overview of JavaScript, we can now finally get to ReactJS. So ReactJS is essentially a JavaScript library for building user interfaces. So it says pretty much in one sentence what ReactJS is. It's a front-end JavaScript library. So the thing about ReactJS is that it only deals with one aspect of the full stack sort of web architecture. It deals with what the user sees, and the main selling point of ReactJS is that it gives us a much more flexible way to use JavaScript inside a website on the front end, on the client's end. So unless we couple ReactJS with another framework, we can't essentially do anything other than the view side of things, the front end side of things. So we'll get into that much more. It is being maintained by Facebook. It is being used by Facebook and maintained by Facebook and the community. So that gives us a lot of advantages as per updates and such. And moving on, is ReactJS an MVC framework? As I was discussing before, what MVC means is model view controller. So basically in the diagram we can see how it works, how the MVC architecture traditionally works. So first we have the view, which is seen by the user. The user sees the view. Whenever you load a website, you get a view, right? You load up Facebook, you get a view. You get the login page, and you get to enter the username and the password, whatever website you are accessing. And you see it, you use it using the controller. You type in the password and username that you have. The controller transfers that information into the model, which is the server side script. And when the server side script gets the login information, gets the account creation information, whatever the server side script gets, it manipulates. It basically manipulates that, updates the view that you might be getting. So it sends a new view towards you. So say that you've logged in to your account. Obviously, you will not keep seeing the login web page. You will get into the account web page. You will get to your home page of your Facebook account or your Gmail account. You will not keep seeing the login page. So that is how the view is updated, and you then get to see the new view. And then accordingly, it's a cycle. Then you implement something new. Say you want to mail somebody, you create a new view for that by clicking on compose email, and then the controller does the same thing over again. So that is how the MVC framework essentially works. So what does ReactJS, how does ReactJS fit in over here? Is it an entire MVC framework where it does all of these things, or does it only do one thing? So as we can see on the left hand side of the view the view thing in the diagram, we have the ReactJS logo. So basically what meaning to imply is that ReactJS on its own only deals with the view aspect of things, the user interface aspect of things. All of the other backend activities, all of the other controller activities are being operated upon by different elements, which we can use React.js when we couple with it, but React.js on its own only deals with view. So let's read up what's written over here. React is only concerned with rendering data to the DOM. So creating React applications usually requires the use of additional libraries for state management and routing. So basically what this implies is when you're using React, you can only see the user interface, but to create the routing management, what it means that to go from one view to the other view, you cannot simply do that using React.js. You need another libraries for that, more libraries for that. So Redux and React Router are some of these libraries which you can couple with React.js to implement a sort of a controller model logic with it. So basically, no. The answer to if React.js is an MVC framework, it's a no. So moving on. What is the ReactJS syntax? So briefly looking at the ReactJS syntax, we'll obviously get into the hands-on later, but right now we'll just give you the basic idea of what the ReactJS is. So as we can see here, we've created my React app and used it as an ID for this particular ReactJS file that we have over here. We've used script type text Babel. We'll discuss what Babel is essentially afterwards, and we're using a function, and what we're returning inside that function is quite interesting, and this is the flexible aspect of React.js that I was talking about a while before. Is that we're basically sending something that looks quite familiar, right? It's an HTML H1 that we're returning using a JavaScript function. So basically what React.js gives us is the implementation to return something that could be rendered in a web browser as HTML. Although this is not HTML, this is JSX, and we would be discussing what JSX is later too. But as of now, we can understand how we can look at it is that within the H1 tag, we have props.greeting, which is obviously inside a curly bracket, and the curly brace implies that the code within the curly brace is JavaScript. So basically what we're doing over here is below we can see that there's a variable app, and we've used a variable greeting to store the phrase hello world, and when we basically perform the React DOM.render, it basically tells the React.js application to render whatever function that we are calling. And as we can see, the ID is my React app, and we are using the .get element by ID, my React app, and basically this executes the entire React.js file. So when we execute this, the thing that would print on the screen on the web browser would be hello world. So this is the flexibility that React.js provides. It gives us the way to basically use JavaScript, use HTML, something similar to HTML within JavaScript, and JavaScript within that. I know it's confusing, but within that JSX we can use JavaScript once again. So that is the advantage that we get from React.js. So basically what this means is that the JavaScript engine present within a web browser can parse this JSX code, which is similar to HTML code, parse it as JavaScript, and it can give you the view. It can render that JSX code as HTML elements and basically create new elements for you to see within the web page that the user is seeing its result on. So that is the advantage of JSX. It gives you the flexibility and the coding language that JavaScript can provide you with, and it gives you the front end functionality of HTML. So moving on. Now we'll get to the hands-on part, guys, which I'm sure you guys have been waiting for after the theoretical. So we'll basically get into the basics of React.js. We'll create a simple application to get you started on how React.js works, and then we'll get into further learning section of things. Welcome to the hands-on section of the tutorial. We will now download Node.js because we need a backend for the React.js project that we're going to do. So go to nodejs.org and get the most stable version of Node.js. Now, once you've gotten that, once you've installed it, you can open up the most efficient, the most handy IDE that you use. For me, I use Visual Studio Code. So I'll open that up. So here we have Visual Studio Code. Now to create any new project, we obviously need to create a folder. So firstly, we'll create a folder. We'll first close this up. I think I already have Visual Studio open. Yeah. So we first create a folder. You can create this folder anywhere you'd like, and just go into open folder, go navigate towards the folder, and open it up. So right now I have one folder created, which would be React demo. This is a project that I've already created. I'll create a new one, new file, which would be new file, new folder, which I would call React projects. Once you've created that, you can click on the folder, you can right click on it, and you can click on open in terminal. So this would basically give you the CMD prompt from this directory. The directory is the project directory that you've created. Press enter so you can type it out. The first thing we'll do is initialize it with a boilerplate ReactJS, Node.js folder structure. So what we need to do is to initialize it, we need to write npx create react hyphen over here, create react app, and then we'll add whatever name you want. For now, I can call it React project. So it'll take some time. Yeah, a new React app has been created inside that directory. It'll take some time to install all of the dependency and fetch the data. So we'll wait up. So we basically it takes a lot of time depending on the internet speed that you may have. Yeah, so it's finally loaded. We've initialized the project. We can now see and confirm whether we have done that. So all the node modules have been loaded up. So this, the public, the SRC, this is where we'll primarily do the coding part of things. We don't need to concern ourselves with node modules in public. Discussing what all of these subdirectories have, this is the folder called node modules. So basically all the packages that you've installed and you would need later on for your React project are installed in the node modules folder. The public is basically, as you can see, there's an index.html. So if you've started off with web development, you would know what this is. Basically the boilerplate web development HTML code. We close that up. We will be dealing with the React project, so we will be dealing with the SRC folder, the source folder. So all of these files, the app.css, the style file, the JS file, which would be primarily the React program that we will be dealing with, and the app.test, we will just go ahead and ignore that. Index.js, index.cs. Basically, you can create as many modules as you want, depending on the project functionality or the web page or the website functionality that you want to have with React.js. So without any further ado, let's get into the project. Now that we've created the server, we can see that it's running on HTTP localhost 3000. HTTP, the local IP address that I have, it's the port 3000. So the server is running successfully. Now, whatever edits we make, once we save it, we can refresh the page and see the edits being made in real time. So that's a good thing about these development environments. You can see what you're changing, and it amounts to faster development. So firstly, we'll look at the index.js file that we have over here. As we can see, this react dom.render seems quite similar to some of the syntax that we saw in the presentation that we were having just before this. So we can see over here that it's rendering something called app, and this app is referring to this app.js JavaScript file that we have, which is also a React file. And this is basically giving us the view of the reactjs.org page that we're having over here. This is how it's happening. So and we have obviously an app.css for that to provide the styling for it. So if you've done HTML CSS, you will understand this as well. So basically you can take up a style sheet from a CSS file and use it in a JS file as well under the JSX section, wherever you're returning the JSX value. Say here we're using this. We've added a class name, we're using that same class name over here. So that is how we are basically implementing that. So the peculiar thing to notice over here is this get element by ID root. So this is over here in index. You have index.html under the public folder. If you go down over here, you have div ID root. So as you can see, the no script says you need to enable JavaScript to run this app. Very obviously, you need to do that. So as you can see, even in the comments, this HTML file is a template. If you open it directly in your browser, you will see an empty page because there is nothing in here. So essentially, what this is referring to is that whenever you render this react dom.render, whenever you run this function in the HTML, the index.html file that we have over here in public, it's taking that source from the component that we have over here and it's rendering it in that HTML. That is why we're referring it as document.getElement by ID root. We're rendering it in that HTML file, whatever the user loads up whenever he opens the website. So moving on. Firstly, before we get started with the tutorial, we will delete everything that is here in the app.js file so we can start it from scratch. Firstly, to make this app.js into a React.js component, first we need to import React, because obviously this is a React file. So we need to import the module that we have in the node modules. So first we'll import React. This is how you import React from, and this would be the module name, which is React, and we add semicolon after that because that's in the syntax. Then we need to create a function for this component, which is app.js, and we create an app function called app. We don't need to create a function with the same name as the JS file. That's not necessary. I'm just doing it as right now. And then we'll return a JSX value. So how do we return a multi-line JSX value? We'll just add a round bracket for it, and we'll add something similar that would seem similar to HTML, which would be div, adding a division, and we'll just add an h1 file, h1 element. Say we want to write hello world, because that's what we write whenever we're trying something new, any new coding language. So once we've done that, we'll add semicolon over here to close it as an element, return, and then we'll export this because exporting it is important so that it can be accessible by other JS files or other elements of the program. And we'll use the function name, whatever function we're exporting, we'll use that name, and we will save this. Then we will check out the index.js file that we have over here. As we can see, what we're doing over here is we're rendering apps. So whatever is there in the app.js file should render whenever we run the website. So we'll just go into the web page, we'll refresh it, and as you can see, we have the hello world over here. So it has changed from the previous element to the hello world. So basically what our code is doing for us here is whenever you go into the app.js file, let's remove the 8 over there. I think that's the OBS causing some issues. Whenever you go into the app.js file and you return this HTML looking JSX value, it basically creates a new element, a single element. Right now it's creating a division element which is containing the h1 tag. We can add multiple tags over here. We can add an h2 if we want, and we can add like something like hello world to save it. When we go and refresh this, we'll have this over here. So what React is basically doing is compiling this JSX code into HTML. So what we will do next is add some dynamic functionality to the code, because that's what ReactJS is primarily useful for. We'll just create, I would say, another function, and we'll just create it inside the app itself. We don't need to create another function for it. We'll just go over here, and we'll create a const function. Say rather than writing an entire function for it, we can just create, say, hello world. So something would reflect on our console. So the way to do this is create a function is using const. This, and then we'll open up a curly bracket. In this function, I say I would like to display some message on the console. So we'll do that. Console.log. I would want to say the console says hello world. We've done that. Semicolon over there, and we'll just put a semicolon at the end of the function. Now that we've wrapped up the function, we can essentially, since we're using ReactJS, the advantage of ReactJS is now that we can use JavaScript within the JSX element present in the return statement of React. So say we've printed hello world 2, or we've rendered hello world 2. If we want to add a button for printing that the console says hello world, we want to do it on click of a button, add some dynamic functionality to the code. We can simply use an implement that JSX provides, as opposed to HTML. We just simply add on click, and then we obviously use some curly bracket. If we want to denote that we're using JavaScript code, we use curly bracket for that. We will say hello world, which already showed up, and then we will add the name for the button. For the button, I would say, what should we call it? Tell me console hello world, we'll call it that. Once we've done that and we save that, and we go back to the website, it should show a button. Now, to just show that it's acting dynamically, I'll just press F11 to see the console, F12 see the console. Whenever I click console hello world, it says over here on the right hand side, the console says hello world. So that is basically how we implement some dynamic functionality using ReactJS. Another cool thing we can do with ReactJS is implement reusability, as we had discussed before. So say that we've used this division JSX element where we say hello world 2 times and we add a button for it. What if we want to use this again and again as an element on our web page? Should we write this again? Like repeat this 3 times, as we could just Control C and Control V it 3 times, or we could just copy all of this logic, copy this over here, copy all of this logic, and we will create a new component. We will call this say. We always use camel quotes in JS, which would mean the first letter should be small. Say hello world.js. Create a new component. We'll do the same thing again. This is a react.js file. We'll import react from React, and we'll add a semicolon over there, and we'll paste the logic. So we can call this something else. We can call this say hello. And it's basically implementing the same logic again, and we export this. Export default say hello, so that it's accessible by other files. And why don't we go ahead and remove everything that is present in this return statement, because that would be redundant as we're doing it in another statement again. So what do we do next? So before we actually do anything, we need to, since we've imported that file, we actually need to, since we've exported the say hello world component, we need to import it before we implement it in our code as a reusable sort of factor. So what do we do for that? We will simply write the function name that we need from here, which is say hello. We will say hello, I think that's the function name, and we'll use from, and we'll add the directory that is required. So it's in the same directory. So we'll just use a dot slash and we'll use say hello world, and that should import whatever functions are present in that module. So we'll just put semicolon over there. So now what we'll do is the most efficient thing about ReactJS is we can simply write it as an HTML element function name, and it will basically implement it. We'll write say hello, and we'll close it off. Once we've done that, we can check the web page as to what changes it will reflect. We are getting some errors. Firstly, we'll remove this function as it's not being used in the newer version of the code that we have here. We'll remove this curly bracket and semicolon, and we'll compile this once again. We'll look at how it's functioning, how it reflects on the website. So what we were doing wrong was we were not using proper casing. So what it means is in the say hello world function, we were using something like say with a small s and starting with a small s, which was not proper casing syntax followed in JS. So we'll remove that, and we'll just export it with a capital letter, which is just a function hello, and we are importing hello from say hello world. So once we do that and we just use the hello function over here, what basically we achieve is this. So basically gives the same output. Console says say hello world. So now we come to the reusability aspect of the code. What we'll do here is if we want to repeat this, say we control C this and control V it 5 times and save this. So this should show the element 5 times. So this way we are achieving code reusability, and this is one of the biggest advantages of using ReactJS. Now suppose we need to change the styling for the text that we've used in the hello world statement. So what we will do for that is we'll simply go into div in the say hello world.js, and we'll write a class name. We'll call this class name hello style, and we'll close off the Angular. Once we save that, and we'll go into app.css, we will add a new class over here. I'll call this name. The class name is hello style. We'll open up the style bracket for this, and over here we'll add something like background color, and we'll use aqua, and we'll save that. So we can't actually use the style if we don't import it, so we'll first import the CSS sheet that we have. We'll import styles, this app.css, and that will be about right. I'll control this this and check the website. And now for every component that we're using, the background color has been changed to aqua. So another way you can add some sort of modularity to the code is say that you've added the background color to the elements, right? You've added aqua for the elements. Wherever you see the hello world statement, the hello world division modules, we've added the background color of aqua. Say we want to add a different color for the entirety of the website. So we'll simply go into the main website structure, that's the main web page structure, the main division, the main element that we have. And we'll basically go over here and add another class name. And we'll create another class name. We'll call this website style, and save that up. And once we've saved that up, we'll go into we'll import the style sheet in this as well, and the address for the style sheet is app.css. Add semicolon right over here. Now, obviously, we need to create the style in the style sheet. We'll go over here. We'll create dot website style. Over here, we'll add the attribute value, background color, to something a little more contrasting with not much contrasting, but a little more different than the generic aqua, black, aqua marine. Save that. Go into that, and as you can see, the space between the elements is filled with the color of aquamarine. This kind of looks good, better than the previous iteration where it was had a background color of white. So obviously we're using functions. This hello statement is a function, right? So what we can do here is we can pass some parameters to that function. Say we want to pass a message to the parameter of the function. We want to pass something other than hello world. We may pass I am good, and just copy this over. Actually, I forgot. I have to add forward slash over here, backslash over here, add it over after the element ends, and we add this again. Let's add space over here. Let's copy this, and we'll replace the slash with that. Let's add space over here. So we've called the hello function 5 times, and we've passed the parameter I am good. We can change this to I am bad, I am evil, I am okay, I am alright. So these are 5 different messages. We're going to say hello world. So what we can do now is, once you've passed that parameter into the function, what we can do now is pass a props parameter over here. So what this props would do is we're taking the input that is being given from here. We're taking these parameters and basically behave in a similar manner. I'll demonstrate. First, we'll remove these h1 and h2 tags. We'll add a h1 tag over here, and basically write the parameter reference, and we'll write message, which is what we are passing to this function, the parameter value, the message. So this again implements the concept of reusability and modularity in the code. So once I save this, and this I also saved, I'll go to the website and it says props.message. So can you tell me what's wrong? It's a very simple, basic question. So what we've done wrong here is we've actually not put this into a JavaScript encasing, because we are using this as JavaScript code. We are not using this as HTML elements. This props.message is not an HTML element, and it's taking it as literal text. So once we embrace it in curly brackets, it will be taken as JavaScript code. And once we save that, now we'll get the actual output that we're looking for. So we're getting I'm good, I'm bad, and all of the parameters that we had passed. So this way we can implement reusability in JavaScript ReactJS code. So thank you for attending the session, guys. If you want to contact us for any information regarding our courses, you can contact us using the contact details provided to you on the screen.